Welcome to Whitewater Leadership. My name is George Hutchinson and I'm Chief Exec and founder of Effra. Effra is a crisis and reputational risk advisory firm, and I've spent the best part of the last 30 years advising business leaders and leaders of organisations and charities when they're facing into major risks and systemic threats and crises. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Polly Neate. Polly.
Thanks, George. Thanks everyone for listening to the podcast. I'm Polly Neate. I'm an expert advisor for Effra, and I also convene the Social Insights panel for the Future Governance Forum. I'm really excited to be co-hosting this series of podcasts which look at what I think are some of the most significant challenges facing leaders in any sector, as George said. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the wisdom of some of the most well-respected leaders in the charity sector. As a former chief executive myself of Shelter and Women's Aid, I've definitely had my share of some Whitewater experiences in my time.
Our guest for today's episode is Kate Lee. Kate is former chief executive of the Alzheimer's Society, Young Lives versus Cancer, and has just joined the National Council for Voluntary Organisations as its leader. Kate, welcome to the podcast and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Brilliant. So before we really get into it, Kate, just tell me a little bit about what you think it takes as a leader, particularly in the charitable sector, to help manage risk and the challenge that is acute at the moment.
I think there's so many aspects to the risk that chief executives particularly are facing. It is a really challenging time, unquestionably, and I think, we've always lived through challenging times. This is my 33rd year in the sector, and I think we've every year said it's more challenging than ever. But there does seem to be something at the moment that is particularly stretching. And I think the challenge around risk is twofold. One is there's the professional risk to our organisations, which gives us all sleepless nights. Can we meet demand? Those income streams coming in, relationships with government, relationships with unions or the stakeholders, really challenging times. But then there's also personal risk. So the risk to us as leaders, our reputations, the implications, things like social media on that. I think I've probably never felt more likely or at risk of being cancelled than any time in my professional career. Hopefully not today.
Yeah, be careful. Yeah. So today we want to specifically focus on a challenge that I think a lot of leaders are facing, which is the combination of increased demand for services from the beneficiaries of the organisation, coupled with reduced resources to actually meet that demand. Can you talk a bit about what the effect of that is on the leader of an organisation when they're having to manage that loss of balance, if you like, between resource and demand?
So I think there's pros and cons, actually, if I was honest. I think the downside of that is well rehearsed, which is, I think we all feel a pressure. We went into these jobs because we deeply care. And in those moments, often as chief executive, there have been moments in my career when I felt like I'm playing God. I am making a decision about which services get closed, which aspect of a beneficiary's needs are least important. And I think sometimes we don't talk enough about the sense of pressure that brings to us as leaders. It is an awful feeling, and you can't keep everybody happy. So however you manage that, however you try to resolve that, you know that there will be losers from that situation. You cannot meet all beneficiaries' needs as the demands grow. You know that if you're trying to think about how do you tailor it to the most in need, it often feels like you're ignoring, certainly when I worked in dementia, everybody's needs are huge. So tailoring at that really sharp end is ignoring hundreds of thousands of people who are just struggling every single day. And we're like, oh, well, never mind them. They'll have to cope. We're going to focus on these people who are literally in safeguarding measures. And that's an awful feeling. I think the positive side of this, if I was to eke one out, is that it is driving innovation across charities in a way that people are starting to understand. So I think you are able to engage in a better conversation now with volunteers, with staff members, with donors, that is about saying we can't keep going like this. We've tried to just take more calls on the helpline. We've tried to extend the hours of the helpline. We've tried to award more grants. We just can't keep going. It's unsustainable. And therefore now is the time to take a step back, using this as a burning platform to say we need to do something differently, and whether that's introducing AI, whether that's operating in different ways, partnerships, collaboration, mergers. I think probably this environment is bringing some of those things to a fore in the way that I've not really seen a real appetite for in the past.
And so, Kate, when you think about that, and you spoke about pressure actually as part of that challenge, my experience, and I think our experience of working with charity leaders and leaders within your sector, has been that sometimes there's a piece whereby, because your mission is so fundamentally good, it's very hard to do some of the difficult things in terms of change and actually landing that, because everybody's joined to do in a way to benefit society. Yet actually, if you're cutting the size of a workforce, how do you do that in a way that keeps everybody together?
Yeah, I've been really interested recently, and I've been reading quite a lot about courageous leadership and about the importance and the growth of the need for courageous leadership. And I find it really fascinating. There was a great article recently in the Harvard Business Review. And I find it really interesting. I've been talking to some chief execs about it, about, are we training for people for that? Are we explaining the need for that? I think we've been courageous leaders in the sector for a very long time, and a lot of people are burnt out. And how do you then find it in you to have courage to take those brave decisions when you're already kind of exhausted and running on empty? And so again, I think it's really thinking about whether that situation is going to change and whether we need to do things differently. I'm loving some of the models of shared CEO roles that I'm seeing emerge at the moment. I think that's a really interesting concept of how that can help keep people more, I hate the word resilient, but kind of stronger, and, having someone in that shared CEO role with those shared pressures, it is a really lonely job, I don't think anyone understands how lonely it is until they do it. And so I think they're not going to go away. And I think we have got to work out what it'll take to be courageous, be brave, stand up to government, stand up to those people who don't and haven't got the best interests of our beneficiaries at heart. How are we going to actually do that when people are on their knees?
Yeah, and getting it round to the point of risk then. So can you just talk about, you've talked about this incredibly pressurised situation and the personal toll it takes, the organisational toll it takes. Thinking about risk and particularly reputation, what are the risks that you identify if you're leading an organisation that's going through this situation we've been talking about?
So firstly, and I don't say this glibly because I know it's slightly more complex than this, but I think reputational risk is over promoted, is a bigger concern, certainly for a lot of board of trustees, than it actually ends up playing out being. So if I look at Alzheimer's Society, when I joined, going through a significant reputational risk issue at the time, very public concerns being raised at that time in the papers, and yet Alzheimer's Society has gone on to have its 5 best ever performing years. And that's not purely down to me, that's purely down to, often when we're in charities, it feels like the end of the world to see our charity being in the paper. But the reality is, it is tomorrow's chip paper, and people do forget about some of that, the general public, donors, supporters. They want to see change, they want to see difference. What I also think is we don't consider risk often in the long enough term. So I will sometimes say, this is a huge risk and it's not going to be popular. I closed a children's cancer holiday centre when I was at Young Lives versus Cancer. It was one of the most awful times in my professional career. It was very shocking. But being able to talk about the fact that there was no long-term future for the entire charity if we continued to hemorrhage money through that centre. And, saying, what is the real risk here? The risk is, 6 months of a very difficult period, a year, pernicious complaints from family members, lots, genuinely, people extremely hurt, upset, grieving. Hearing that, dealing with that, But the reality is, if that doesn't happen now, what is our long-term future as an organisation? So I think it's something about balancing that.
And there, Kate, I think you've really touched on something. So, for us at River Effra, when we're thinking about risk and reputational risk, ultimately it's only ever secondary. Have you solved the problem? Is there a real risk there? And you're talking about a financial risk that is there to the organisation that actually, I guess, can threaten its mission. And it's about balancing those different needs, but doing it when there is a massive spotlight on you and the pressure that that creates.
Yeah, and there's ways of managing that risk, which, most chief execs of charities, I think, know instinctively. So, thinking about your major donors in advance and talking this through with them at a point at which you are not already committed. So I think sometimes really bringing donors in, it's not a way that we often think about almost co-designing or co-producing the solution to some of our biggest challenges with our donors. But I think the point at which things need to change are significant. I think about the fantastic Julie Bentley and the work she's doing at Samaritans at the moment. Just incredible. There has been incredible work done by Hillary at National Trust. These are leaders I really admire because they've really ripped the plaster off saying this is going to have to happen. So managing that risk in advance, as much communication as you can, honest, absolutely lay it on the table, the size and scale of the problem. One thing I often say to my own managers is, if you're asking me how do we word this when we talk to the staff, how do we word this when we talk to volunteers, my answer will be, let's start with the truth, right? Because let's just have an adult to adult conversation about what's going on here and why we're trying to do that. And I know those conversations are difficult. So I think there's something about managing risk and also proportionality of risk. I remember being a very difficult decision we made at Alzheimer's Society. And we talked about the fact, it was around our long goodbye advert, actually, which was very controversial at the time, very challenging. And we talked about the fact that if 1% of our donors withdrew their £5 a month or their £10, £20 a month, that would be a loss to the organisation. It would be devastating. No one wants to upset donors. But thinking realistically about how much that was and how likely was it 50% of our donors would remove their funding as a due. So constantly then also kind of trying to keep the size and scale of the potential risk in some sort of kind of context.
But really facing into it before it happens so that you understand what it looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can't always do that. I mean, sometimes with the best will in the world, things go wrong.
Next question. Yeah. So things do sometimes go wrong suddenly, or you can actually lose income in a charity quite quickly sometimes and unexpectedly. And I was going to ask about that what about when it isn't possible to plan for this? But also, I'm quite interested to hear what you've got to say about managing the board of trustees in this situation.
Yeah, I think so. Talking risk through in advance, one of the things that I think is really useful with boards is to try to keep the risk conversation live the whole time, so that what you're not doing is constantly lurching from one crisis to another. I think that's what unsettles boards. It has unsettled me as a trustee when I've been on a board, was just like, oh my goodness, this has gone wrong. And I'm like, well, I didn't even know that was a thing that could go wrong, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's something about keeping the risk conversation relatively live with trustees. And the other thing is a no surprises rule with boards. And again, I think that's hard if you have quite an executive board who you raise a risk with and you say, look, just so you know, this could happen. And I don't think it will. I'm trying to keep it in context. But of course, what happens is the board then overreact and say, well, can we have these 27 pieces of work done? And let's bring a consultant in and you're like, wait on a minute. And the temptation, if you have a board that does that, is to stop telling them about things early. And that, I think, is a really honest conversation chief execs and chairs should have as soon as that starts to happen, which is your response as a board to me raising that things are coming is actually making me not want to raise things are coming. And it's I've found myself in all these situations over the years, and I think it's just trying. This is where the courageous leadership comes in, even when you're exhausted, is just trying to keep the conversation honest.
And it feels like when we're sort of advising from the outside that the risk tolerances of different audiences has dropped. So boards feel a little bit more shaky sometimes when there are challenges, and lots of charitable organisations actually work at the hard end of the world. And you're expected to hold higher standards than everybody else, yet when you look to potentially to the regulator and others, Are they willing to actually manage the risks that you need to be able to manage as a charity?
I mean, that's a huge conversation that I'm looking forward to getting stuck into as Chief Executive NCVO on day 6. So you're going to have to give me time. But I think that is really, really important. So board's risk aversion and growing board risk aversion, what is that really about? Is that about potential closure of the charity? Well, we know what it's about. It's about the concern that beneficiaries won't receive vital support. And everyone in the organisation, boards included, are driven by that need to get that support and help out to beneficiary groups, whoever that is or whatever that is. And that fear, of course, is driving boards to worry about, what the future of that is. I think trying to address it early, so thinking in advance, what would it mean to merge? When would we trigger a merger? Could we continue to serve our beneficiaries well by a merger? Just thinking some of these things through in advance of them needing to happen, I think reassures boards. So I think boards understanding what the plan B might be can be more reassuring and can stop a board overreacting in the moment. But you're absolutely right, is the rest of the processes within our sector lined up to support that? So regulation, I'm interested to understand whether a lot of our training competencies, skills of our staff across the sector are lined up to be able to deal with this level of ambiguity, and hold risk. I'm really interested in thinking about the leadership. I think we focused a lot on leadership. It's incredibly important, but where are our next leaders coming from and are they prepared? I think a lot of our young leaders have still got the oomph to be really courageous, and I'm excited to see what we can do by giving them bigger voice in the sector. And also about the stories we tell. We tell a lot of stories in the sector at the moment. It does worry me. I know I'm an eternal optimist, but it worries me that every conversation we have at the moment is about exhausted chief execs that are struggling, that are dire, that have got terrible boards. Those conversations are swilling a lot around the sector. It's putting good people off wanting to be a chief exec. It's putting good young people off wanting to join the sector when that's all they hear. And yet there's lots of things about these jobs that remain incredible, and our organisations remain incredible, and we mustn't lose sight of that, because we are creating our own downward spiral if all we talk about is how exhausting this is and the downsides of being there, rather than actually the brilliant opportunities we've also had because we do these jobs.
Yeah, I coach a lot of leaders in the charity sector now, and I am definitely seeing a level of pressure that I think is pretty unprecedented. But I'm also seeing a group of people who are loving their jobs. Yeah. It is a massive privilege to lead a charity, and it's fun, isn't it? It's really fun. I guess I'm interested in you're moving into a new role now, and a lot of the examples you've been giving about your own experience have been in big charities. Do you think there's any specific challenges in smaller organisations when they get to this point of, less resource, more demand? Is that worrying you as you go into the role at NCVO?
Yeah, I think it is undoubtedly a big pressure. I've been a trustee of charities like Copperfield, World Child Cancer, which are far smaller. Yeah. And, the loss of, a donor is significant. It's make or break. Charities that are operating on well below minimum reserves, if indeed any reserves, and trustees saying is the brave decision to spend down reserves, meet demand and go out of business. But we did what we could when we could. So really hard-edged discussions going on. But equally, I'm seeing really exciting innovation. This is creating platforms for chief executives to have conversations that just have not been, people haven't been open to in the past. Yeah. Really hard-edged collaborations. Donors excited about seeing applications from 3 or 4 charities and accepting there's some risk in that. It might go wrong. These collaborations are not as straightforward as just donating your money to one person and holding them to account. So again, I'm seeing really innovative donors really supporting more of that work. So people like the Lloyds Foundation, People's Postcode Lottery with the Dream Fund, really exciting innovation work. And I'm hoping that there's more of that for small charities locally as well. I'm seeing less So say in the children's cancer space, a lot of families after their child dies of cancer very understandably will set up a small charity, often working in the space of that. I'm seeing more people looking to establish charities like CCLG and saying, actually, could you do something? We'll fundraise for you. Could we have a product in our child's name? So I'm seeing real innovation being driven from some of this change as well.
Do you think there's anything funders could do better in this whole kind of really difficult balance situation that the sector's in? Because to put my 2 pence in, I do. I think as we speak right now, all around the country, right, there's people in charities rewriting what they already do to make it look new and innovative so that they can put an application into a trust or a foundation. And that can't be right when we're talking about the core being under threat. So I guess, what do you think about funder behaviour and how that can help?
I would love to see funders coming together in the way that charities come together, because I don't know how much a lot of trusts and foundations, I might be wrong, I'm sure there are platforms for this, but share about the best practice between them. There was a great article on LinkedIn by Clara Govia, the chief exec of People's Postcode, really challenging other funders to work as they do with unrestricted funds. Yeah. And I really like that. And I think funders need to hold funders to account. This isn't only being driven by the charities, which are often not in a great position to challenge. But I would love to see, we've got some incredibly innovative funders in the UK, and I would love to see more of a driver from them to actually challenge each other about best practice, share evidence of how that's working, challenge some of the myths that other trusts and foundations hold, particularly about, if we don't restrict this money, they'll spend it on pop and crisps. Like, they won't. And, we've got funders who are funding unrestricted funds who hold the evidence that that doesn't happen when you fund it. So I would love to see funders come together to really explore some of that as well.
Yeah, and I think that point actually about unrestricted funding it's massive in a way, because there's almost an assumption that if the end beneficiary gets 100% of the money every time, that's always the right answer. Whereas actually, when you think about it, if you've got to pay for safeguarding in certain spaces, security, whatever the charity is actually working in and its area of expertise, actually sometimes it can be almost systemic, the challenge, because if the funders are saying it's got to be restricted, it can only go over here, then actually sometimes doing the right thing isn't always available to the charity leader.
No, it isn't. And this is a complete soapbox for me, as everybody knows. 100% of every single donated penny always goes to the beneficiary. It doesn't go anywhere else because we don't have trust funds in Barbados that we siphon it off to. So if that means that I have to spend some of it on ensuring that the fire extinguishers are serviced or that the cyber security training, that's how I run a safe, well-functioning charity that you can trust your money to. And that's part of ensuring that those beneficiaries get a high-end, well-serviced, well-functioning, safe service that's as efficient, as effective as it could be. And we need to stand up for that more. We must stand up for that more. And I, really challenge that conversation. I hate the pence and the pound. I've written strongly against it in the past. But I think it is also for infrastructure organisations like NCVO and others to really start hammering home these messages across, the stakeholders that we influence. It's hard to get any message out to the great British public. It's incredibly expensive. When I look how much McDonald's spends on selling Happy Meals, I realise how much it costs to actually change public behaviour. But what we need to do is have one consistent message about the fact that we run our organisations efficiently, effectively and well. We get maximum reach with balanced against maximum impact for the best resources we've got. And we should really stand up for that and take a stand for that. And again, I think funders that support us in that are incredible. The other thing I'd love to see is some of these funders actually doing some more work on some of the fantastic leadership training that we've got going on across the organisation, which shouldn't be only for charity staff. We should start having merged leadership events. So organisations like Clause Social Leadership, I think they're incredible for thinking about what goes on in the future. Could we be actually bringing, foundation trustees together with charity trustees to train them on AI, cybersecurity, risk, whatever we're training on, can we do that together? And certainly when we're training on the future of things like courageous leadership, we shouldn't be doing that on our own. We should be doing it with key stakeholders.
Yeah. I mean, the other point about the core funding or unrestricted funding is that in my experience, charities, having moved from the private sector into the charity sector, the sort of back office functions capacity in charities is incredibly reduced by the lack of restricted funding. So then when you're trying to manage complex change, the risk is enhanced because you just don't have necessarily the scale of HR function, the scale of finance function, the level of training of those people as well to manage complex change really effectively.
Yeah, another thing I've seen a lot of recently across the sector is that we've done a lot of recruitment for potential because of our salaries and because of, wanting to give people opportunities, driving our diversity and inclusion agendas. This is fantastic and I love it and I'm incredibly pro it. But there's a point at which we also need to be in a position with our pay to recruit for experience because we actually need someone who's done it before. Yeah. Chief execs, it's brilliant to have people with potential. Bringing on a whole new generation of charity leaders is so incredibly important. But there is a point at which as chief exec, I actually need someone who's done it because I cannot continue to kind of hold someone's hand through that first time they try to do it. I just need someone I can give it to. And that creates and is creating a kind of difference in the organisation around our things like use of consultants, which I think is, getting that balance right. If they're used well, I think that can bring the experience. And then how do we use, when we are spending money on consultancy, how do we use those consultants to bring along that potential into experience? So how do we get bang for buck that's out of using those consultants that's way more than just the report they bring, but how do they actually develop the staff that they're working alongside? So how do we make this the whole thing, just squeezing all the juice out of this lemon?
Yeah, and as a consultant, George can speak to this, I'm sure, but trying to leave the organisation so that they don't need you again.
Yeah.
So building that capacity, and that's something you focus on, isn't it?
Absolutely, because ultimately you're held to account for the money that donors give you as a charity, and it's got to be value for money. So if we're there as consultants, but we're sitting and is it really delivering value? That's the question we have to ask ourselves continuously to make sure. So enabling the organisation to properly learn and do it for itself rather than come at it and time and again be reliant on a consultancy, I think is incredibly important. And so we work very hard to ensure that happens from that perspective. And it comes back to that, in a way, I guess the big picture piece that you've been talking about. So yes, we started in risk, but actually there's huge benefit and opportunity, and you've talked about how you're actually championing a more positive future at the same time for the charitable sector when it is, I think, more needed than ever, in this country and then globally.
Yeah, I think for me, I think it's still an exciting time. It's still the best sector, to work in. It is still the most rewarding job. I wouldn't have it any other way. I mean, I did finish at Alzheimer's Society and I knew I wanted to be a chief exec again. I think, it's tiring, it's exhausting, it's frustrating. We have all the challenges we've talked about, but we need to also talk about the positives and the excitement and how it feels when you get a win. I mean, my team last night found out that they'd got some funding and such a high level of excitement across the organisation. We need to bottle that and we need to keep talking about that because otherwise my view is, like the NHS, we are doomed. Who on earth will come into this sector? Who will be our next generation of leaders? Why would you want this job if the only thing that you hear when you talk to your chief exec is how miserable they are? And that's really hard to say. And I think people must think I don't understand how complex the job is, and I absolutely do. But I also believe it's amazing.
It is a huge privilege to do the job, and it's been fantastic listening to you. Just if you could give one tip on managing risk for charity chief executives, what would it be?
Talk a lot and early. Yes. So it's about communications, as there's so many of these things. It's about having a position with your board, particularly by which you can feel confident to early flag risks without a sense that you're going to be driven into a whole load of action you don't need. And similarly with staff and other stakeholders. So early flagging, not particularly as back covering. There's a little bit of that actually, and we need the little bit of that as chief exec.
And we need our personal reputations, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's just thinking about it, trying to find time for it. I am the worst for on those executive team meeting agendas. Risk ends up at the bottom and the thing that gets dropped every single meeting, like we must look at the risk register next time. Just try not to do that. And the other tip I'd give quickly is to say, sometimes don't look at the risk register, just get everyone to sit back in the room and say, what are you having sleepless nights about? And often what comes out is nothing.
It's not
On the risk register. It's a completely different set of things. I'm like, well, that was stealing. So pads down, pens down, what's everyone losing sleep over is a great question to identify your organisational risks.
And I think that just leaning into it, making sure that actually you don't necessarily see it as a threat. If risk is managed really well, it's not a threat to the organisation. It's actually just part of the day job done well for that organisation, and that makes the difference.
Definitely keeps things calmer when stuff goes wrong. Keeps it calmer because people talked about it in advance. They knew this might come. It's not a surprise. It gives them control over something when it's often at a time when it feels like there's very little control.
And the most common bias we see from leaders when they're really challenged by these things is what we would describe as persecution bias. It's so hard, it's so difficult, and actually I think you've given a brilliant articulation of it can be so good, and it's such a privilege to kind of lead these organisations, and we need to support leaders to continue to do that.
And what opportunity does it bring, if any? Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just awful, losing a massive funder, seeing a service close that is desperately needed. This is just awful. But what opportunity does it bring? How can you get more out of that situation? Is it an opportunity to do a press release about the needs of these beneficiaries? Is it an opportunity to promote your cause further? Just go for it and don't over egg the reputational risk problems, because hundreds of charities have had reputational risks over the years and they're still funded and they're still here.
Yeah.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. If you're listening and you thought that this was an interesting discussion, please do share on your socials and engage with us at #WhitewaterLeadership. Thank you for joining us, and Polly.
Yeah, thank you from me as well. And do follow me and River Effra on LinkedIn to get news of all podcast episodes as they drop.